There's a tremendous amount that goes into the calculation of how much financial aid people get.
The original purpose of need analysis was to try to find some way to assess the family's ability to pay.
EFC is the expected family contribution, and essentially that is the amount of money that a family could be expected to pay towards a student's higher education.
There is a clear tension between having a simple formula for allocating student aid and having a formula that really carefully differentiates among people and manages to give most of the money to people who need it most. It started out seeming like it could be simple, but, in retrospect, I don't think anybody could have really designed a very simple and very well-targeted system. There are trade-offs. Right now, the formula that's used to allocate federal student aid is legislated by Congress. It's still based on a formula that long ago was developed by colleges and universities.
It was the Ivy Leagues who started in the early 50s. In the early days, things were relatively simple. Some basic financial data from the family was gathered, but questions came up inevitably about, okay, well, this family's income has one wage earner earning it. This family's income this is the same as the first one, except two people are working. Are they the same? There's one of many, many questions. By the late 50s, more institutions were interested in how the Ivy Leagues had done it and were following along.
Colleges decided that it really made sense to coordinate their efforts to allocate student aid. So a group of colleges formed the College Scholarship Service, which was part of the College Board, and together they developed a formula looking at people's incomes, at their assets, at their ages, trying to figure out how we could best allocate the funds in the most equitable way.
The American College Testing Program was a late player in the late 60s, but they had their own way, which sometimes differed in the results. As more and more funds got involved and more students were taking advantage of them, things got more complicated.
1972 was critical because it created the Pell Grant, which is the real reason for rationing.
At the time that the Pell Grant program was started, people just thought, we have students who don't have any money, we need to give them some money. And then they said, okay, how are we going to decide which students those are?
There was a core need to identify low-income students who were eligible for Pell Grants. Interestingly, Senator Pell, from the beginning, believed that we could have a very simple tax subtraction method in which a parent and a student could actually calculate a Pell Grant on its own and mail it into the federal government by simply taking the maximum award and subtracting the taxes they paid.
But they put in then, they decided not to use the income tax thing. They actually wrote a separate formula of how that they would do this. Not a need analysis system like we were used to in trying to figure out families' ability to pay for the campus-based programs that the schools liked. It was really more of an eligibility formula in terms of how you would distribute these monies across on a broad basis.
The Pell Grant program had its own means test, and it was very securely focused on low-income students. And the student loan programs had a distinct and arguably more realistic means test, need analysis, that targeted middle-income students.
So in '86, there were a lot of different methods of need analysis that were going around because institutions obviously also had an interest in knowing how much aid that they would need to provide to supplement what a family could be expected to provide.
There was a recognition among policymakers that the federal government had turned over the rationing of its resources to institutions and other providers of information and services, and it recognized that at some point it needed to be in control of its own rationing.
Congress finally just got fed up with the whole process because it was so complicated and so on, and said, look, if we're distributing these dollars and so on, we want to make certain that people understand that this is federal money.
Now, what we ended up doing was taking the formula that the community had devised and writing it into law with a few tweaks of one sort or another.
The 92 amendments took the need analysis in the Pell Grant program and the congressional methodology and put them together and created the federal methodology.
It wedded the two programs, and the result was some measure of significant redistribution of aid, which shifted Pell Grants to more middle-income students.
One of the most significant changes to the need analysis was the elimination of home value from the assessment of assets. So one of the real significant impacts of eliminating home values from the need analysis is that it tends to make more middle-class families eligible for financial aid.
And that's the first time, I think, that I can remember in my time period where we deliberately attempted to make students who were middle or higher income suddenly eligible for financial aid.
But it became very clear to us that Congress could not achieve its objectives for fair and equitable distribution of student aid funds unless it controlled the formulas and controlled the forms.
Prior to 1992, it was possible to apply for a Pell Grant or federal student aid by not using a federal form. There was a federal form. It was called not the FAFSA, but the AFSA, the application for federal student aid. However, an individual student, their parents could also use the CSS form. They could use the ACT form to apply for federal student aid.
You really can't operate a unified system of federal student assistance with, 5 national forms, 33 state forms, and a fee-driven system and be fair to students and parents.
Congress changed that in the 1992 amendments and required federal aid to be applied for by students and their families through a federal form and a federal form only.
The idea was that you wanted this to be a form that is going to be used. And to do that, you have to have enough questions without having too many. Many states were using basically the same system as the federal government, and states themselves had lots and lots of questions that they felt critical to determining how their aid be distributed. But accommodating all of those state questions, in addition to perhaps a lot of questions that institutions might like to have answered, led to a very, very long form.
The simplification debate and the ability to get the FAFSA created was probably the most difficult, but the single most important achievement in 1992.
FAFSA on the web was important because it opened entire new opportunities for simplification. Because you could do it electronically, you had options to use skip logic to pass over questions that don't pertain, to group the questions more logically, and to have an easy process.
Toward the beginning of the Bush administration, there were a number of reports that came out talking about the complexity of the student financial aid system and its impact on low and middle income borrowers gaining access to post-secondary education. So there was legislation to authorize the Advisory Committee on Student Financial Assistance to look at needs analysis and determine whether the methodology could be simplified without adversely impacting students and family income and other metrics that were important within needs analysis. They did 3 regional hearings and released a report in 2005 that recommended 10 steps that Congress and the administration could take to simplify the needs analysis.
I created what I called the Commission on the Future of Higher Education, which came to be known as the Spellings Commission. They developed a report that talked about accessibility. Do we have a financial system that makes post-secondary education affordable for many, many more people? And we talked about ways to do that.
So when it came to the recommendations of the Spellings Commission around simplification, we couldn't do nearly as much as we wanted.
However, from 2005 to 2009, Congress did pass a few minor bills around the financial aid system that addressed simplified needs test, income protection allowance, auto zero, and some other changes. So the 2008 reauthorization of the Higher Education Act created the EASY FAFSA, which is an effort for students and families to fill out only the questions that were applicable to their financial aid system.
The simplification for the financial aid form was something that the president talked about during the course of the campaign. And one of the things we realized was that we could actually just make the form easier to use and to complete. And that populating that form had been a challenge for many people in terms of accessing the information and completing it. So anything that we could do to make that easier, we wanted to do.
So one of the ways that was done was through the IRS and the Department of Education getting together and realizing there was a way that the IRS could allow applicants to access their own tax data and automatically put it in the form.
Right now, many families begin to fill out the FAFSA from around the January to the March timeframe. They have to report their family income from the previous tax year, but most families don't receive that type of information until they get closer to the April 15th deadline. And so there's a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced in the House and Senate in order to allow the use of prior year. And prior would let students and families look at their family income for 2 years ago.
People fail to see that there's a difference between simplifying a formula versus simplifying a process. Something like, Facebook is a pretty simple interface. It's very complex behind the scenes.
We have a pretty complicated financial aid system, and some people are certainly overwhelmed by it. Some people don't fill out the forms, don't apply for financial aid because it's so complicated. It has gotten a little simpler over time.
So the key with the FAFSA is to make it long enough to have integrity and short enough to be used. If you ask too many questions, you discourage low-income families. If you ask too few questions, you will create a market for an alternate form. And it's a delicate balance.